The moment my wife laughed, I knew something inside our marriage had already died. Not quietly. Not peacefully. It died in front of other people, under warm restaurant lights, between half-finished drinks and polite smiles. And the worst part wasn't the joke itself, it was how easy it was for her to say it. We were sitting at a long table, the kind meant for celebrations. Birthdays, promotions, anniversaries. Someone had just asked how long we'd been married. 7 years, she said, leaning back in her chair, swirling the ice in her glass. 7 years sounded solid when she said it, like proof that we'd made it. Then she tilted her head, smiled, and said, "Honestly, I think the hardest part was accepting I'd always be the taller one in the relationship." People laughed. Not cruel laughter. That was the problem. It was casual, comfortable, like she'd said something harmless. Someone added, "Hey, at least he's confident about it, right?" Another person joked about high shelves and step stools. Glasses clinked. Conversation rolled on. I smiled because that's what I've always done. I smiled because I didn't know what else to do with the heat rising in my chest, with the sudden awareness of my feet on the floor, of my spine against the chair, of how much space my body took up, or didn't. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself it was just a joke. I told myself this wasn't the hill to die on. But something in her eyes told me this wasn't new. This wasn't an accident. It was a truth she'd been carrying, waiting for the right moment to let out. As the night went on, I barely heard the conversations. I watched her instead. How relaxed she was. How unbothered. She reached across the table to grab my hand once, squeezed it, like a performance. I noticed she didn't look at me when she did it. On the drive home, the car felt smaller than usual. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, lighting her face, then shadow, then light again. I waited for her to say something. An apology. A clarification. Anything that would tell me I hadn't imagined the weight of that moment. She didn't. "So," she said finally, casual like we were talking about groceries. "You were really quiet tonight." I kept my eyes on the road. "You embarrassed me." She sighed. Not surprised. Not concerned. Tired. "Oh my God," she said. "It was a joke. If you were confident, you wouldn't care." That sentence landed harder than the joke itself. Because I'd built my entire adult life around not caring. I'd learned early on that being a man like me meant compensating. Be agreeable. Be useful. Be stable. Don't make waves. Don't draw attention to the things you can't change. If you're good enough in every other way, people won't notice what you lack. I thought that was maturity. I thought that was strength. At home, she went straight to the bedroom. I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the counter like it might explain something to me. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Familiar. The same place I'd come back to every night believing it meant stability. That night, lying next to her in bed, I realized how wide the space between us had become. She was on her phone, screen lighting up her face. I watched her thumb move, fast and practiced. She smiled at something. Not at me. "Who are you texting?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. "Just friends." I nodded, even though a tightness had started in my throat. I wanted to ask more. I wanted to say something real. Instead, I turned onto my back and stared at the ceiling. There was a faint crack above the closet door I'd never noticed before. I traced it with my eyes, over and over, until it became the only thing I could focus on. That was the first night I understood what it meant to feel small without anyone saying a word. Over the next few days, the joke followed me everywhere. At work, while answering emails. At the gym, watching my reflection between sets. In the shower, with the water beating against my shoulders like a reminder. I replayed it again and again, each time hearing something new beneath the laughter. Disappointment. Resentment. Comparison. It wasn't about height. Not really. It was about how long she'd been measuring me against something else. Friday night, she sat across from me on the couch, knees tucked under her, voice calm in a way that scared me. "I think I need some space," she said. "Just to think." Another soft word that felt like a door closing. "Is this about the joke?" I asked. She tilted her head, studying me like I was asking the wrong question. It's about a lot of things. I waited. She continued, I just want to feel small sometimes. You know? Taken care of. I don't want to always be the strong one. There was. Not hidden. Not dressed up. I've taken care of you, I said quietly. I've always been here. I know, she said. You're safe. The words sat between us like a verdict. She packed a bag that night. Not everything. Just enough. At the door, she kissed my cheek, quick and familiar, like muscle memory. We'll talk soon, she said. I nodded. The door closed, and the apartment exhaled. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the silence, realizing how much of myself I'd wrapped around being chosen. Being tolerated. Being enough in ways that didn't inconvenience anyone. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, watching the city wake up through the window. Somewhere between the darkness and the light, a thought surfaced that terrified me more than losing her. What if she was right? What if I'd mistaken shrinking myself for love? As the sun rose, I realized this wasn't the end of something comfortable. It was the beginning of something honest. And I had no idea yet how much it was going to cost me. I didn't go looking for him. That's the part one tell myself when I think back on it. I didn't stalk her. I didn't dig through her phone or interrogate mutual friends. I didn't need to. The truth has a way of stepping into your life when you're already unsteady. 3 days after she left, I woke up to a silence that felt heavier than the one she'd left behind. Her mug was still in the sink. One shoe sat by the door like it had been forgotten on purpose. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at it, wondering if she'd come back for it or if this was already considered over. I made coffee I didn't want and opened my laptop for work. Emails blurred together. Words lost their shape. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A notification. Her name. Not a message. A photo. She'd tagged herself somewhere downtown. A rooftop bar I'd mentioned once, casually, months ago. The sunlight in the picture was generous, forgiving. She looked lighter somehow. Freer. And standing next to her, arm around her waist like it belonged there, was a man who didn't need to be introduced. He was taller. Broad shoulders. Easy posture. The kind of man who never had to think about how he entered a room. I told myself not to zoom in. I did anyway. Her head was tilted toward him, resting just below his shoulder. I recognized that look. I'd seen it on her face years ago, back when I thought love was about proximity instead of presence. I closed the laptop. The room felt like it was leaning in on me. Every surface suddenly reflected something I didn't want to see. The mirror in the hallway. The dark window. Even the blank TV screen. So this was the space she needed. That evening, she called. I let it ring twice longer than usual before answering. Hey, she said, like we were picking up a conversation that hadn't been fractured. I just wanted to check in. Check in on what? I asked. The pause. On you. I almost laughed. I saw the photo, I said. She exhaled slowly. I figured you might. Is that him? Another pause. Longer this time. Yes. There was. Undeniable. I didn't plan for it to happen like this, she said. But I didn't want to lie to you. I leaned against the counter, suddenly aware of how tired my legs felt. How long? It doesn't matter, she replied quickly. That answer told me everything. You look happy, I said. I am, she said. And then, softer, I didn't know how unhappy I was until I wasn't anymore. The words slid into me, slow and sharp. I searched for anger and found something worse, understanding. Is it because he's taller? I asked. I hated myself for asking. Hated the way my voice flattened, like I was bracing for impact. She didn't deny it. It's not just that, she said. But it's part of it. With him, I don't feel like I have to explain myself. I don't feel like I have to be the strong one all the time. I closed my eyes. I've never asked you to be strong for me, I said. I know, she replied. That's the problem. After we hung up, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch, phone still in my hand. I replayed her words until they started to lose meaning. I wondered how many times I'd confused being low maintenance with being invisible. That night, I went out for a walk just to feel something move. The city buzzed around me, cars, voices, laughter spilling out of open doors. Couples passed me, some arguing, some leaning into each other like gravity was optional. I caught my reflection in a shop window. Same height. Same face. Same man. But suddenly I was seeing him through her eyes. Measuring. Ranking. Wondering what he lacked instead of what he carried. The next day at work, my manager pulled me aside. "You good?" he asked. "You've been quiet." "I'm fine," I said automatically. He nodded, already moving on. Safe again. Invisible again. That evening, she texted me. Said she'd come by later in the week to grab the rest of her things. Like this was a logistical problem instead of a collapse. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Okay," I typed. I didn't ask about him again. I didn't need to. He was everywhere now, in the silence, in the comparisons, in the way I stood a little straighter without knowing why. That night, lying alone in the bed we used to share, I realized something that made my chest tighten. She hadn't left me for another man. She'd left me for an idea of masculinity I'd never challenged. And for the first time, instead of asking how I could compete, I wondered why I'd been playing a game that was never mine to win. The hardest part about being alone wasn't the silence. It was how loud my thoughts became once there was no one left to distract me from them. The apartment settled into a new rhythm after she left. Mornings came without urgency. Nights stretched longer than they should have. I stopped turning on the TV just to fill space. I wanted to hear myself think, even if I didn't like what showed up. I started noticing things I'd trained myself to ignore. How every decision in this place had been negotiated. How every piece of furniture was chosen because it was neutral. How the walls carried none of me. No risk. No edge. Just compromise layered on compromise until it looked like harmony. One evening, while looking for a charger in a drawer I hadn't opened in years, I found an old notebook. The cover was worn. The pages were bent at the corners like they'd been revisited and abandoned more than once. I sat on the floor and flipped through it slowly, each page feeling like a quiet accusation. Business ideas I never pitched. Trips I never took. Thoughts that started strong and ended in question marks. I remembered exactly when I'd stopped writing in it. The year she told me she needed stability. At the time, it sounded reasonable. Responsible. I told myself ambition could wait. That dreams didn't disappear just because you postponed them. But postponement has a way of becoming permanent when no one is pushing you to remember who you were before you became convenient. I sat there for a long time, notebook open, pen resting in my hand without moving. I realized how much of my life had been built around not being a problem. At work, I was reliable. The guy who stayed late without being asked. The one who didn't rock the boat. Promotions passed over me quietly, like whether I pretended not to notice. In my marriage, I was adaptable. The one who adjusted. Who listened. Who absorbed disappointment and called it patience. I told myself this was maturity. But maturity without self-respect is just surrender with better posture. I tried writing again that night. Not goals. Not plans. Just honesty. The words came slower than I expected. I'm tired of apologizing for existing. I stared at the sentence until it felt heavier than the notebook itself. Then I tore the page out and folded it, like it was something dangerous I wasn't ready to keep. The next day at work, something small happened that shouldn't have mattered. A meeting. A project I'd quietly carried for months. My manager praised the outcome, then credited someone else for the leadership. I felt the familiar urge rise, to let it go, to remind myself it wasn't personal, to tell myself being noticed wasn't the point. Instead, I heard my own voice say, "Actually, I led that." The room went quiet. My manager blinked, surprised, then nodded. "You did." That was it. No applause. No confrontation. But something shifted inside me. On the walk home, I replayed the moment again and again. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was new. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't over-explained. I just stated a fact. It made me wonder how many times I'd handed pieces of myself away just to avoid discomfort. That night, I cooked dinner for one and didn't rush through it. I ate slowly, sitting at the table instead of the couch. I noticed how different the apartment felt when I wasn't waiting for someone else's reaction. Afterward, I pulled out the notebook again. This time, I didn't tear the page out. I wrote about the joke, about the photo, about the word safe and how it had hollowed me out. I wrote about height, not as a flaw, but as the excuse I'd allowed to define my worth. Somewhere between sentences, something became clear. I hadn't lost her because I was short. I'd lost myself because I'd been shrinking long before she ever said the words out loud. I closed the notebook and set it on the table, right where I'd see it in the morning. For the first time since she left, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt exposed. And underneath that exposure was something unfamiliar and uncomfortable. The beginning of honesty. As I turned off the light and went to bed, a thought followed me into the dark, quiet and persistent. If being enough had cost me this much, what might it take to finally be whole? I didn't wake up that morning feeling brave. If anything, I felt exposed. Like I'd peeled something open the night before and left it uncovered. The notebook sat on the kitchen table where I'd placed it, innocent and accusatory at the same time. I made coffee and avoided looking at it, like it might ask something of me I wasn't ready to give. The truth was, I still didn't know what confidence was supposed to feel like. I only knew what I was tired of. I was tired of cushioning my words. Tired of rehearsing conversations that never happened. Tired of apologizing for taking up emotional space. At work, the day started the same way it always did. Emails. Meetings. Familiar faces moving through familiar patterns. I slid into my chair, opened my laptop, and prepared to disappear efficiently. Then my manager called a last-minute meeting. We gathered in the small conference room, the one with the glass walls that made you feel exposed even when no one was looking. The agenda was simple, upcoming leadership assignments. The kind of meeting I usually sat through quietly, taking notes, pretending not to notice when my name wasn't mentioned. As my manager spoke, I felt that old tightening in my chest. The instinct to stay small. To remind myself that recognition wasn't the point, that stability mattered more than ambition. Then he said it. He assigned a project I'd built from the ground up to someone else. I felt the words hit before I fully processed them. My hands went cold. My mouth went dry. The room blurred at the edges. This was the moment I usually swallowed. This was where I told myself it wasn't worth it. But something in me shifted, not dramatically, not loudly. It felt more like a quiet refusal. I need to say something, I heard myself say. Everyone looked at me. My manager paused. Sure. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I just spoke. I've been leading that project for 6 months, I said. I built the framework, coordinated the team, and handled the client relationship. I'm happy to collaborate, but I want my role to be acknowledged. The silence that followed was sharp and unfamiliar. Then my manager nodded. You're right, he said. That's on me. Just like that. No argument. No backlash. I sat there stunned, not because I'd won, but because I'd expected punishment for speaking. After the meeting, one of my coworkers clapped me on the shoulder. Didn't know you had that in you, he said, half joking. I smiled, but the comment stayed with me. Neither did I. On the way home, I noticed how different my body felt. Straighter, lighter, like I'd been carrying unnecessary weight and finally set it down. That evening, I opened the notebook again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I wrote about the meeting, about the fear, about how I'd confused silence with professionalism. I wrote about how often I'd apologized before anyone accused me of anything. Sorry for taking time, sorry for asking questions, sorry for needing more. Somewhere between lines, another realization surfaced. I wasn't angry at my wife. I was angry at how easily I'd agreed with her version of me. My phone buzzed. Her name. A text. I'll come by Friday to pick up the rest of my things. No question mark. No emotion. I stared at the screen, waiting for the familiar rush of anxiety. The urge to accommodate. To soften the moment. Instead, I typed back, Friday works. Nothing else. I set the phone down and felt something settle in my chest. Not relief, not excitement. Resolve. That night, I began writing something new. Not a letter to her. Not yet. I wrote a list. Things I would no longer apologize for. Taking up space. Wanting more. Being seen. Not fitting someone else's definition of strength. I didn't know what I was going to do with the list. I only knew it felt like a line being drawn. Before bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Same height. Same face. Different posture. For the first time, I didn't measure myself against an absence. I didn't imagine someone taller standing beside me. I just stood there. And in that stillness, I understood something I'd spent years avoiding. Confidence wasn't about convincing anyone else. It was about deciding I was done asking for permission. As I turned off the light, the thought that followed wasn't fear. It was anticipation. Friday was coming. And for once, I wasn't planning how to disappear. Friday arrived faster than I expected. All week, the apartment felt like it was holding its breath. I noticed details I'd never cared about before. The faint scuff on the wall near the door, the uneven leg on the kitchen chair, the way sunlight cut across the floor in the late afternoon. I didn't rush to clean. I didn't try to make the place look like something it wasn't. I wanted it to look like the truth. At exactly 6:30, there was a knock. I didn't jump. That alone felt like progress. When I opened the door, she stood there with 2 empty suitcases and the same composed expression she'd worn the night she left. Her hair was different. Her jacket wasn't one I recognized. Small changes that told me she'd already started rewriting herself without me. "Hey," she said. "Hey," I replied. She stepped inside like she still belonged there, eyes scanning the room, already categorizing what was hers. I noticed how she waited for me to move out of the way. I didn't. She hesitated for half a second, then walked around me. We started in the bedroom. She folded clothes quickly, efficiently, like emotion would slow her down if she let it. I leaned against the doorframe, hands in my pockets, watching without comment. "This is weird," she said eventually, not looking at me. "It is," I agreed. She glanced over, surprised by the lack of accusation in my voice. "You're being calm." "I'm trying something new," I said. She gave a small laugh. "Well, don't start pretending now." I didn't respond. Silence has a way of revealing who expects control. She zipped one suitcase and sat on the bed to put on her shoes. "So," she said, casual again, "are you seeing anyone?" The question landed exactly where she meant it to. "No," I said. She nodded, like she'd confirmed something important. I figured. I watched her tie her laces, remembered how often I'd waited for her to finish speaking before deciding how to feel. "What about you?" I asked. She froze just slightly. "Yes," she said. "I am." There was the comparison she'd come prepared to make. "He's good to me," she added. "He makes me feel secure." I almost smiled. "That's good," I said. She looked up sharply. "That's it. That's it." We moved to the living room. She packed books, small decor items, pieces of a life we'd built carefully enough to never challenge either of us. Her eyes landed on the kitchen table. The notebook was there. And beside it, a single red envelope. "What's that?" she asked. "For you," I said. She frowned. "A letter." "A note," I replied. She picked it up but didn't open it yet. "Is this where you tell me how wrong I am?" "No," I said. "It's where I tell the truth." She studied me like she was looking for cracks. "You've changed." "I didn't," I said. "I stopped editing myself." That landed harder than I expected. She set the envelope back down, suddenly cautious. "You know," she said, "you don't have to prove anything. This whole tough act, it's not really you." I met her eyes. "You're right. This isn't an act." Her jaw tightened. She finished packing the last suitcase and wheeled it toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped, hand on the handle. "You were always good to me," she said. "That's why this is so hard." I nodded. "I know." She hesitated. "If you'd just been more confident." I didn't let her finish. "I was," I said quietly. "Just not in ways you respected." She flinched. For the first time since she walked in, she looked unsure. She glanced back at the table. At the red envelope. You don't have to read it now, I said. Or ever. Her fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. I will. She left without another word. The door closed softly behind her. I stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet return. It felt different this time. Not empty. Not accusing. I walked back to the table and sat down across from the empty chair she used to occupy. The notebook lay open to a blank page. I picked up a pen. Whatever she would feel when she read that note was out of my control. What mattered was this. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for her reaction to decide who I was. As the light faded outside and the city hummed on, I leaned back and exhaled. The hardest part was coming next. And for once, I was ready to let the truth speak for itself. I didn't write the note all at once. Thought I would. I thought it would pour out of me in one clean, dramatic rush, like all the speeches I'd rehearsed in my head over the years and never delivered. But when I sat down at the table after she left, pen in hand, nothing moved. The apartment was quiet in a different way now. Not waiting. Not aching. Just present. I stared at the blank page and realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't about saying the right thing. It was about not lying anymore. So I started slowly. I wrote about the night of the joke. Not what she said, but what it did to me. How it confirmed something I'd been afraid of my entire life. That I could do everything right and still be seen as lacking. I wrote about how I laughed along because I didn't know how to defend myself without sounding weak. How I learned early on that men like me were expected to compensate quietly, not complain. I stopped when my hands started to shake. I realized how easy it would be to turn this into an accusation. How satisfying it would feel to list every moment she made me feel smaller. I didn't do that. Because this note wasn't for revenge. It was for clarity. I wrote again. I thanked her. The word looked strange on the page, but it was honest. I thanked her for the years we shared, for the version of myself I became with her, even if that version had learned the wrong lessons. I thanked her for showing me what I'd been willing to tolerate. That part took the longest. I paused often, listening to my own breathing, noticing how different it felt to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. This was the kind of silence I'd avoided my whole life, the kind where you're forced to hear your own truth. Then I wrote the sentence I'd been circling since the beginning. I was never too small. I stared at it for a long time before continuing. I just stood next to someone who needed me to be. Something in my chest loosened as I wrote it. Not anger. Not pride. Relief. I wrote about responsibility. How I'd agreed to a version of myself that was easier to live with but harder to respect. How I mistook being chosen for being valued. How I'd apologized for things that didn't require forgiveness. I didn't excuse her behavior. But I didn't center it either. For the first time, the story wasn't about what she did to me. It was about what I allowed. When I finished, my hand was cramping and my coffee had gone cold. The page was full, but the feeling wasn't heavy. It was clean. I folded the paper once. Then again. Slid it into the red envelope I'd bought impulsively earlier that day. Not because red meant anger. Because it meant visibility. I left the envelope on the table where she couldn't miss it. Then I waited. Not for her. For myself. When she came back to read it, I wasn't in the room. I'd gone for a walk, letting the city absorb the nervous energy I didn't want to put on her. I didn't need to see her reaction to know what mattered. But when I returned later, the envelope was gone. The notebook was still there. I sat down, opened it, and wrote one last line beneath everything else. I choose myself. I didn't know how she'd react. I imagined confusion, anger, maybe tears. What surprised me was how little I needed to know. That night my phone buzzed. A message from her. I read the note. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. I didn't know you felt that way. I stared at the screen, feeling something close to compassion. I typed back slowly. I didn't either. Not until I stopped trying to be what you needed. A few minutes passed. You're different, she wrote. I smiled. I'm the same, I replied. Just not silent anymore. I set the phone down and leaned back in the chair. The apartment felt bigger than it ever had. Not because it had changed. Because I had. For years, I thought closure came from being understood. That night, I learned it came from understanding myself. I stood up, turned off the light, and walked into the bedroom without checking my phone again. Somewhere between the quiet and the dark, a calm certainty settled over me. The note wasn't the end. It was the line I'd finally crossed. And on the other side of it, I wasn't smaller at all. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. That's what surprised me the most. 2 days after she read the note, there was another knock at my door. Not the confident, controlled knock from Friday. This one was softer, uneven, like she wasn't sure she had the right. I stood on the other side of the door for a moment longer than necessary. Not out of fear, out of awareness. I wanted to notice what I felt before I responded. What I felt wasn't anger. It wasn't hope either. It was calm. When I opened the door, she looked different. Not in the superficial ways I'd grown used to noticing. Her posture was tighter. Her eyes searched my face like they were looking for something they expected to be missing. "Can we talk?" she asked. I stepped aside. "Sure." She walked in slowly, like the apartment had become unfamiliar territory. Her gaze landed briefly on the kitchen table, then moved away. The red envelope was gone, but its presence still hung in the air. "I didn't expect that note," she said finally. "I know," I replied. She nodded. "I thought you'd be angry. Or bitter. Or defensive." I leaned against the counter. And instead, her mouth opened, then closed. She tried again. "Instead, you sounded grounded." That word again. Grounded. "I didn't realize how much I hurt you," she said. "I swear, I never meant to make you feel less than." I believed her. That was the strange part. "I know," I said. "But intent doesn't erase impact." She flinched, like she wasn't used to me finishing a thought like that. She stopped herself, took a breath. "Reading it made me realize how much you carried quietly. How much I took for granted." I studied her face. The uncertainty. This was the version of her I'd always hoped would show up earlier. But hope had changed shape. "I'm glad the note helped," I said. "That was the point." She looked at me carefully. "Is that really all it was?" I met her eyes. "Yes." The silence stretched. Then she asked the question I'd been expecting. "Is there really no way back?" The old version of me would have rushed to answer. To soften the moment. To reassure her that I was still available if she changed her mind. Instead, I let the question sit. I thought about the nights I'd stared at the ceiling, wondering how to be smaller without disappearing. About the years I'd mistaken endurance for love. "No," I said gently. "There isn't." Her face changed then. Not dramatically. Not with tears. Just a quiet collapse of certainty. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. "Is it because of him?" I shook my head. "No." "Because of the joke?" "No." "Then why?" I took a breath. "Because I finally like who I am when I'm alone." That was when her face went pale. Not with fear. With understanding. She sat down heavily in the chair, like the weight of that sentence had nowhere else to go. "I didn't think you'd ever leave," she said quietly. "I didn't either," I replied. She looked up at me, eyes searching again. "Are you happier now?" I considered the question honestly. "I'm steadier," I said. "And that feels better than happy ever did." She smiled sadly. "You've changed more than you think." I smiled back. "Maybe. Or maybe you're just seeing me clearly for the first time." We stood there, two people who knew each other deeply and not at all anymore. At the door, she hesitated. "I hope he knows what he has," she said. I understood what she meant. "So do I," I replied. She laughed softly, then stopped. "Take care of yourself." "I am," I said. After she left, I locked the door and rested my forehead against it for a moment. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because I wanted to remember how this felt. No rush. No regret. No shrinking. I walked back into the apartment, noticing how quiet it was, and how alive that quiet felt now. For the first time, her reaction wasn't the point. My decision was. And as I stood there, breathing evenly, one thought settled in with absolute clarity. I hadn't won. I'd finished. All that was left now was to live like it. The morning after she left for the last time, I woke up without the familiar weight on my chest. It wasn't joy. It wasn't sadness either. It was space. I lay there for a few minutes, listening to the city come alive outside the window. Cars. Voices. A distant siren. Life moving forward without waiting for me to catch up. For the first time in a long while, that didn't scare me. I got out of bed and stood in front of the mirror. Same man. Same height. Same body I'd spent years apologizing for in ways I never fully understood. But the way I looked at myself had changed. I wasn't scanning for flaws. I wasn't measuring myself against an invisible standard. I was just present. Solid. I made breakfast and ate it at the table, sunlight warming the side of my face. The notebook sat nearby, closed now. It had done its job. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was a record. Later that day, I went into work and did something small that would have felt impossible a month earlier. I asked for what I wanted. Not aggressively. Not defensively. Just clearly. My manager listened. Asked questions. Didn't promise anything dramatic. But he didn't dismiss me either. And when I walked back to my desk, I realized how much of my fear had been built on assumptions I'd never tested. After work, instead of going straight home, I took the long way through the city. I noticed details I used to miss. How people carried themselves, how confidence showed up in dozens of quiet forms that had nothing to do with height or volume. There was a man shorter than me arguing passionately on a street corner, unapologetic and animated. Another laughing loudly with friends, uncontained. None of them seemed aware of the rules I'd been living by. That night, alone in the apartment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not the fragile peace that depends on someone else's approval. The durable kind. I thought about the man she left me for. The version of masculinity I'd spent so long chasing without realizing it wasn't even mine. I didn't feel resentment anymore. Just distance. We'd been playing different games. Mine finally made sense. Weeks passed. Life didn't transform overnight. There were still moments of doubt. Still nights where old instincts surfaced. But now, when they did, I noticed them. I didn't obey them. I started taking up space in conversations. I stopped laughing at jokes that cut too close. I stopped shrinking myself to make other people comfortable. One evening, standing on my balcony, looking out at the city lights, the irony hit me. I hadn't grown taller. But I'd never stood this straight in my life. I understood then what no one had ever told me. Masculinity isn't proven by comparison. It's revealed by self-respect. I thought back to the joke. The photo. The note. All the moments that felt like endings at the time. They weren't endings. They were corrections. As I turned back inside, I caught my reflection in the glass door, steady, unflinching. I smiled. Not because I'd won, but because I finally knew who I was without needing anyone else to define it. I didn't grow taller. I just stopped shrinking. And that made all the difference.